Hi, I'm Lance Humphreys. I'm the Executive Director of the Mount Vernon Place Conservancy. Welcome to Flower Mart. Next up, the University of Maryland Bee Squad will discuss native and managed pollinators. We hear there's a real buzz. Enjoy.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Dykes. I am the coordinator for the University of Maryland Bee Squad. I'm here today to talk to you guys a little bit about pollinators in general. We're going to talk about the difference between managed and native pollinators. And then I'm going to give you some good information on how you can help support pollinators. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. So who are we? We're the University of Maryland Bee Lab. We're comprised of a number of different students, technicians, researchers. We're led by Dr. Dennis Van Engelsdorf, who has been at the university for a number of years as a tenured professor. We look at honeybee health from an epidemiological perspective. But in addition to honeybees, we also look at native pollinators and pollinator habitat. So we do quite a number of things at the lab. In addition to the teaching and lecturing, we do also work with a nationwide nonprofit called the Bee Informed Partnership, which helps beekeepers around the country keep their bees healthy. So they're similar to a crop consultant. They go out and they actually look at different pests and diseases of the honeybees and help the beekeepers keep healthy bees. So when we talk about pollination, what exactly do we mean? And the basic form of pollination is simply transferring pollen from a part of the flower to another part of the flower in order to facilitate fertilization. And from that, we get seeds. Another thing that we get is fruit that we like to eat. A number of good benefits to pollination. Now, is pollination required? Is a pollinator required for pollination? Not necessarily. Some plants have developed the ability to self-pollinate, but a lot of plants do need pollinators to pollinate. So here is pollen. As you can see, it comes from the flower. The center picture right here is actually honeybees inside of a nest where they've actually packed the pollen away to store it for later. So all those levels you see there are millions of pollen grains compacted that the honeybees actually store for later. It's a form of protein in the hive. Now on the far right, this is some of the variety of pollens that you can see out there. If you look at it under a microscope, you'll notice the pollens all look different. The reason for that is pollen's very similar to a key. It has to have the correct pollen for the correct flower in order for that fertilization to take place. So if a honeybee has a lot of different pollen on her and she travels from flower to flower, from different flowers to different flowers, only the pollen from the flower similar to the one that she's on will transfer and will cause the flower to become fertile. And so that is a really cool thing. It's amazing that this happens. Evolutionary wise, it's something that really sustains us. Without pollination, the food that we eat would be very, very boring. So this is a view of a grocery store with and without pollination. This is actually, I believe, Whole Foods set this up. So pollinators are very essential for our food supply. About 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat are directly the result of a pollinator. As you can see, things like apples, things like different types of cucurbits, different types of fruit, we just wouldn't have without pollinators. It's pretty amazing. Now, you may have heard on either through the internet or on a TV show that Einstein made this prediction that if the honeybees go, we're all doomed in 4 years. I just want to assure you that's not true. Einstein actually never said that, but also our food is not wholly derived from pollinators. It just makes it a lot more enjoyable. So in other words, if we didn't have pollinators, we'd still have things like corn, we'd still have things like wheat, but we wouldn't have those delicious things like watermelons or almonds or apples or blueberries or, you name it. Pollinators are probably involved with it. Even milk. You say, well, how does that happen? Well, the grass that the cows eat, a lot of the different food products that are fed to cows are from pollinator plants. So it's really kind of a neat thing to see that something even beyond what we normally think of as a pollinator food is directly influenced by pollinators. So it's pretty amazing. It's pretty neat to think that pollinators are that ingrained in our life that we don't even realize it a lot of times. So what's a pollinator? Pretty much anything can be a pollinator. This is the cool thing. A lot of people think, oh, when you think pollinators, you think birds, or sorry, you think bees, you think butterflies. But would you believe bats are a very good pollinator? If you like tequila, you have bats to thank for that. Hummingbirds are one. If you are a hummingbird fan like we are at my house, I've actually seen hummingbirds come through already. So it's a really neat time of year to see hummingbirds, but they are a pollinator. Now, how about some other things? Would you believe if I said wasps are pollinators? They actually are. They will help pollinate flowers from time to time. If you go out and look at flowers in your yard, a lot of times you'll see wasps on them, and they're collecting pollen from those flowers to eat. But in the same time, they're actually helping to pollinate the other flowers around them as they move from flower to flower. Now, you also see on this really cool poster that the Pollinator Partnership came out with this year, beetles. That's another thing that a lot of people don't realize are pollinators. So pollinators can be just about anything. There's mammals, there's pollinators, there's birds that are pollinators. You can be a pollinator if you really want. In some areas where they don't have a lot of pollinators, humans actually have to take this place and have to manually pollinate different fruits in order to get, or different flowers in order to get fruit set. So it's pretty amazing to think how intertwined pollinators are with our life. Without them, we really wouldn't have the really amazing world that we do today. So I want to talk first about managed pollinators. And this is what I work with the most. I am the bee squad coordinator and extension coordinator for the lab. Previous to this, I was actually a regulator for honeybees. If you believe it or not, bees have bee cops around there. We don't call ourselves bee cops by any stretch. We're mostly agriculture inspectors, but there's a lot of pests and diseases that are involved with managed pollinators. And so that's what we were looking out for. But what I really like about managed pollinators is they're a big part of our food production system. So we look at them a little different than we would look at native pollinators. So the species that we use the most here in the United States is the honeybee, Apis mellifera. Believe it or not, this is not a native species to the United States. This was actually brought over by the early settlers, the early European settlers to the New World. Without this managed pollinator, we wouldn't have a lot of the fruits and vegetables that we so enjoy in our lives. So managed pollinators are very different from native pollinators, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But for now, I want to just kind of talk about why managed pollinators are so cool and how they help better our lives. So honeybees are a communal nesting bee. This is very different than a lot of native pollinators, which are what we call solitary bees. In other words, there's only one or two of them at a time. There's not a whole lot around at a given period of time. So that while a lot of native pollinators are very, very good pollinators, bumblebees come to mind when I think about this. They're up very early. They work all day. They're big pollinators, so they're able to move lots of pollen around. But the problem with those pollinators is it can be very low populations in areas. It's hard to move them around, and they just don't work for our ag system that we have now. And so managed pollinators are what takes up the slack. And so honeybees have this really neat ability. They're able to be loaded up on a truck. I take an entire hive, one of those big white boxes that you see out in the field. I can take that, put it on a truck, put a big net over the truck. I can put about 400 or a little bit more than 400 on a truck. Take that truck from Maryland, drive it all the way out to California to where it can pollinate almonds, for example. And every early spring, that happens. About 1.5 million colonies from all over the United States get shipped out to the Central Valley in California to just pollinate almonds. Without honeybees, we would not have the almond industry that we have today because almonds are very, very dependent on that. And without the honeybees, we wouldn't be able to pollinate a lot of the crops that we do. And so this next slide is kind of a cool representation of managed pollinators and how they work throughout the United States. Like I said before, a lot of them will go out to California first part of the year. From there, they're only there for a few weeks to up to a month. From there, they'll go to different parts of the United States. They can go up to the Pacific Northwest to pollinate things like apples or blueberries or raspberries. They'll go to the central in the Dakotas to do sunflower, to do different crops up there. They can go down to the south, like Florida, to pollinate watermelons, to pollinate blueberries, to pollinate certain certain orange crops. So there's a lot of different places that honeybees go to pollinate. And I always like the little picture there on the right-hand side. You know, can you imagine beekeeping or trucker bees? So we actually, if you keep an eye on the roads, especially if you're out west, sometimes you'll see the semi trucks. A lot of times they try to travel at night, but you'll see those semi trucks just full of honeybees, and it's an amazing event. And so every time you go to the store and you pick up an apple or you pick up a watermelon or anything like that, go ahead and thank a honeybee, because they were ones to really help facilitate that pollination to make sure that we had the fruits and vegetables that we all love and that we enjoy as part of our diet. So honeybees, they do a great amount of work. We use them in a lot of agrarian enterprises that we do here in the United States and around the world. Honeybees have been managed for millennia now. Some of the earliest pictures came from cave drawings. Believe it or not, the ancient Egyptians used to actually manage honeybees for honey. So it's a neat thing to think about, that honeybees have been around for as long as they have. It has done as much as they have for our society. So we have a lot to thank honeybees for. But honeybees are not the only pollinators. We tend to think of them as the only pollinators because that's kind of what the forefront of what we hear as pollinators, but there are a lot of other pollinators out there. Now, don't get me wrong, I love honeybees, and I love a lot of things they create. The picture on your left there, the Bee World cover, that is a really cool picture of different pollens. You'll see each one of those pollens, they actually represent a different flower. So you can just see from that one picture how many flowers bees visit. And then, of course, on the right-hand side of your screen, the honey jar, very iconic, something we've all grown up with. This is actually honey that we've created here at the University of Maryland. We do sell it as a fundraiser when we have surplus, but it's amazing because honey is one of the few products that, if properly bottled, it can stay on the shelf pretty much forever. Sometimes you'll get what's called crystallization, where it gets a little creamy looking, but that honey is perfectly safe to eat. So I've actually had honey that's over 100 years old, and it tasted just as sweet. So honey is a great sweetener. It has a lot of different types of sugar in there, and it's also something that is a byproduct of all that hard work that the honeybees have done. So now we've talked about the honeybees for a little bit. Let's move into the other pollinators out there that sometimes get overlooked. And actually, to me, I love native pollinators. I love honeybees for as industrious as they are, as for part of our agricultural system. And honestly, sometimes I just go out there and enjoy watching the bees going out of their hive, watching them work what they do. But other bees that I love are the native pollinators. Native pollinators come in so many different shapes and sizes. It blows my mind. We have a big resource here in the Maryland area with the USGS. Mr. Sam Droege, who is the head of one of the labs there, is one of the world's best experts in photographing bees. And so they've gone around and photographed bees from all over the world. They actually bring them back to their shop, and they have this special machine set up to do it. And as a result of that, we get these really awesome pictures of native bees. And I probably picked some of the more showy ones just because, to me, those are the ones that everybody likes to look at, myself included. But this is just a small variety of the native bees we have here in Maryland. We have actually over 427, probably more, native bees just in Maryland alone. Throughout the United States, it's several thousand. Throughout the world, it's probably thousands. We're still naming bees. We still find new ones to this day. Unfortunately, a lot of the native bees are facing declines. If you ever hear about bees going extinct, bees having big declines in numbers, generally we're talking about native pollinators. Now, don't get me wrong, honeybees have a lot of issues facing them right now, between pests, between forage, between pesticides. But when it comes to real damage and real loss of populations, native pollinators are probably the ones facing the biggest. As I'm sure you've heard before, with all the loss of habitat that we have, with converting these beautiful meadows into nice green grass with no flowers, and I say nice kind of sarcastically, we're losing a lot of habitat for these native pollinators. So it's important to think about them when you do things around your house. And we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation about what you can do at home to help native pollinators. There's quite a bit that you can do. But just to start out with, I wanted to show you a couple of these different pollinators. These are ones that are native here to Maryland. I wanted to show you these. These are ones that I've had the pleasure of visiting with myself. The small one on the left-hand side, that's actually a sweat bee. And true to their name, if you're out in your yard sweating while working in the yard or something like that, and you notice a little, almost looks like a little fly that lands on you and starts licking up that sweat, that's actually a sweat bee. They're just mining you for moisture. That's all you are to them. You don't really have to worry about them stinging you unless you really provoke them. They do have stingers, the females do, but generally speaking, they're never going to sting you unless you really upset them. On the right-hand side is a carpenter bee that landed on me one time, or actually was hanging out around one of my beehives, and I fed him a little bit of water, let him fly off for the rest of his day. It's pretty amazing the variety that we have in native pollinators. And like I said, a lot of times you won't even realize they're there unless you really look. A lot of them are very small. A lot of them are only around for a certain part of the year. Most of them are solitary. In other words, you're not going to see a whole group of them at one time unless it's on a good floral source. The only kind of exception to that rule are bumblebees. Sometimes you'll discover in your yard, especially in a pot that's been partially buried or something like that, the bumblebee nest. And so those, they can get a little defensive when you mess with their nest. But when you're out in your yard watching them, bound around from flower to flower, generally speaking, they're not defensive at all. They're not going to attack you. Just like honeybees, they're just out there to try to make a living. They just want to get those spores to feed their young, to continue their line. So native pollinators are something a lot of times we'll overlook, but they're very important to our ecosystems here in Maryland and worldwide. Without native pollinators, we wouldn't have a lot of the plant diversity that we have in nature. A lot of these native pollinators are specialists. In other words, they've grown up around certain plants, and without those plants, they don't do very well. And also without the native pollinators, the plants don't do very well. So it's very important to think about native pollinators when you're planting your garden, when you're planting your flower beds, that type of thing. So a lot to think about there. Here's some other native pollinators. And on the bottom, I know it's a long list right there, but these are some of the websites that you can learn about native pollinators at. At the end of the presentation, I will actually give you some links to different websites that you can use to find out this information. So don't worry about grabbing all that right now. But these are some of the other ones that you'll see out in the in nature, hopefully on all your beautiful wildflowers that you've got planted in your yard and around your home. So the big question I get asked a lot is, how can I help? Not everybody wants to become a beekeeper. Not everybody probably should become a beekeeper. We have a lot of small scale backyard beekeepers here in Maryland and actually nationwide and believe it or not, worldwide. Since I've been doing this for about the last 15 years, I would say that number has doubled, if not tripled, which in a way is good, but also in a way is probably moving a little bit too fast at times. So there's, like I said before, a lot of pests and pathogens involved with honeybees. And so if you are not prepared to really work them and really learn about that, it can actually do more harm than good by getting a honeybee hive. So when you hear people say, oh, I want to save pollinators, I want to do my part, getting a honeybee hive is not necessarily the best thing you can do. The best thing you can do is provide habitat. That will help not only honeybees, but native bees as well. And so by providing that habitat, providing that clean forage for the bees, it will help the most. Reducing or eliminating the impacts of pesticides in your lawn, in your community is very important. Now, pesticides can serve a very important function in agriculture and human safety, especially when it comes to mosquito-borne illnesses. But using pesticides judiciously, using them correctly, using them according to label, and using them only when absolutely needed is an important thing that you can do. There is a form of pest control called integrated pest management, which uses a multitude of different techniques in addition to harsh chemical pesticides to help control pests, which is a very good way to control pest populations. For instance, if you have a lot of pots or old tires or anywhere that holds water around your property, if you remove that source of water, you will remove the breeding areas for mosquitoes. And so you can lower the number of mosquitoes in your area without using any pesticides at all, which is very, very good thing to do and very important. Another thing is reach out to others. If you have this passion for helping pollinators of all types, teach other people about that. Tell people, planting these certain types of flowers will really help. Supporting local bees and beekeepers. So when we say bees there, we mean all the bees. But when we say beekeepers, obviously we mean those that keep the honeybees. The reason for that is, as you'll find, a lot of beekeepers are really great ambassadors for pollinators. We all know that if pollinators in general have a very clean food source, have lots of area to forage, it can be very beneficial for our bees. And so what helps our bees, our honeybees, will also help native bees. So it's very important for that. And then finally, conserving resources, not converting properties to only grass, like turf grass, keeping areas wild, letting wildflowers propagate, especially in the spring, especially in the fall, instead of mowing them down. So a couple ideas for this is just plant flowers, plant beautiful flowers that will help bees. And there's lots of information, and we'll talk about that on the last slide, to point you towards areas to resources that will tell you good flowers for bees. Not all flowers are good for pollinators. Some don't really provide much resources, especially ones that you may find at some nurseries, some large commercial nurseries, not necessarily small native nurseries. But just letting flowers that are in your yard come up, like dandelions. You'll see that top picture on the right side. Those are sunflowers that came up from seeds that I feed some birds outside my house. And they just happened to propagate. They happened to start growing, and I just didn't mow them down. And at the end of the spring, I had this beautiful hedge of sunflowers that the bees used. And then after the bees were done with it, once the seeds formed, the birds actually came and picked them clean. So it was pretty amazing how that happened. And then on the left-hand side is this really cool pollinator garden at the White House. So you can plant pollinator gardens anywhere. It's pretty amazing, and it's very useful for helping pollinators. So finally, some links that I wanted to show you guys. The University of Maryland Bee Squad link right there has all of these listed on our page. So you don't have to plot down all these, but if you want to screenshot this, you're more than welcome to. And if we can ever answer any questions for you about the native pollinators or honeybees especially, feel free to email us at bsquad@umd.edu, or just simply go to our website, umdbsquad.com, and you can find all of our contact information and along with a lot more detailed information on our website. So with that, I'm going to close up my talk right now. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. You can put them in the chat bar, and they will relay them to me. If you don't, I've had a very wonderful time here, and I thank you guys so much for your attention. And I hope that you guys have learned a little bit from this about our amazing bees and ways that you can help them. So guys, thank you so much. And if we can ever be assistants, umdbsquad.com. Thank you so much. It looks like we don't have any questions. So with that, I'll go ahead and close out my presentation, and you guys have a great day. Thank you so much.